Hello, good evening, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us online this evening uh, to discuss Lady Doctors, India's first women in medicine, with author Kavitha Rao. My name is Ruta. I am a curator at the Dr. Bhavdajilad Museum, working with the museum's permanent collections as well as heading the education activities. The Dr. Bhavdajilad Museum, for those of you who may not have been here, it is the former Victor and Albert Museum of Bombay. It is Mumbai's oldest museum, which was first opened in 1857. The museum was under very derelict condition earlier, and between 2003 to 2008, it underwent an intensive UNESCO award-winning restoration project through a public-private partnership between the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai, the Jamnalal Bajaj Foundation, and the Indian Trust for Arts and Cultural Heritage, also known as INTAC, spearheaded by the director Tasneem Zakaria Mehta. In 2008, the museum reopened with a robust outreach and education program, which included special lectures, contemporary art exhibitions, and a focus on inviting people from all walks of life into the museum to engage with our permanent collections as well as temporary exhibitions. Even through the last 2 years of the pandemic, we've been very active online, creating engaging activities for online audiences, as well as researching the museum's collection. The present building of the museum opened to the public in 1872, which means this year we celebrate 150 years of this iconic building in Mumbai. The museum is also available online on Google Arts and Culture for those who cannot come into the museum. And you can also follow our activities online on our website, bdlmuseum.org, as well as on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Spotify. Just to get a little bit more background of the museum, like other colonial museums of its time, the BDL also was founded by medical men, including Dr. George Birdwood and Dr. Bhavdaji Lad, who were the secretaries of the museum committee. Several of the early curators of the museum were also scientists or medical men. Therefore, when I first read about Kavitha Rao's title, Lady Doctors, I was immediately intrigued, and I knew that we had to do a conversation with her and invite her to the museum space, although it's online this time. It is my pleasure to introduce Kavita to all of you who have joined us online. She's a journalist and an author currently living in London. Lady Doctors, the Untold Stories of India's First Women in Medicine is in fact her third book. Her work has also appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, Mint, South China Morning Post, The Hindu, and various other newspapers. She tweets at Kavitha Rao. Kavita, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I extend a warm welcome to you on behalf of the museum director, Tasneem Mehta. In your book, you mentioned that a Google Doodle of Rukmabai Raut on her 153rd birthday in 2017 is what sort of led you on this path. Can you please tell us more about what inspired you to write about the history of Indian women in medicine and why this unique title, Lady Doctors?
Right. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everybody for joining in. As you said, I did mention in the book that, the idea that sort of, made me write this book was seeing a Google Doodle about Rukmabai Raut. And, I knew a bit about her, but not very much. And I did a bit of, Google research and found that there were so many other lady doctors whom I just knew the basics about. I knew their names, Anandibai Joshi, I knew Rukmabai Raut, I knew a couple of names here and there, but I knew next to nothing about them. And it occurred to me, why are we not reading about these women like we read about so many male scientists, Jagdish Chandra Bose, C.V. Raman, Homi Baba. We don't read about these women. They're not in our textbooks. They're not in our museums. They're not, anywhere that there are no roads named after them. So I did a bit of digging. And another thing that sort of, inspired me was that there's this trend in the West as well that, people are talking more about more scientists who have been erased from history. There was a book, Hidden Figures, about, and then the subsequent movie about NASA women scientists who are many Black women who were sort of, erased from history, even though they put in a huge amount of work in getting, the space mission going. And there are many such women, Rosalind Franklin, who was instrumental in discovering DNA, but was sort of, again, sort of erased from history. And I just felt that there were so many interesting stories that needed to be told. And especially now, given that, medicine for Indian women is such a sort of aspirational career, it's like considered, to be a very sort of respectable and good profession for women to be in. But it was not always that way. There was a time when women were called whores, and they were called, pelted with stones and harassed for daring to even enter medical colleges. So I just wanted to uncover some of that. Yeah.
And the term lady doctors.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes. Lady doctors is what, it started out as a sort of pejorative term in the UK when the British Medical Journal called women doctors lady doctors, and it called them a traitresses to their sex, because it was considered then that women need to be feminine and they were more suited to being nurses, and they didn't have the scientific temper to become doctors. So it started out as a sort of pejorative term. And then slowly it became part of mainstream sort of usage, and people would specifically advertise for lady doctors just in order to take care of other women and children and in childbirth. So then it became slightly more respectable. And now, of course, we have come to the point where we perhaps don't really refer to women as lady doctors. We just say doctor. We just go and see a doctor. So that's how the term has evolved, really.
In 1880, a Medical Women for India Fund was set up in Bombay or Mumbai by the American businessman George Kitteridge. Now, Edith Peccei, one of the original Edinburgh Seven that you mentioned in your book, headed the institution, initially out of a smaller temporary structure in Khetwadi, Girgaon, called the Jafar Suleiman Dispensary. It was only by 1886 the Kama Hospital in Mumbai opened. And by 1889, according to your book, and as well as another reference, a newspaper I read online, they were already sending doctors to other cities in Ahmedabad, where the Victoria Jubilee Hospital had been set up. For example, Motibai Kapadia was sent. Yes. Can you please tell us also about this? Who were these Edinburgh Seven, and what was the impact?
Yeah, so the Edinburgh Seven, they were a very amazing bunch of women. There were seven women, seven Scottish women, and they were headed by a woman called Sophia Jex Blake. And at that time in the 1880s, neither British colleges nor American colleges would easily accept women. So Sophia did a lot of begging in order to be accepted to a medical college. And after several years of this, Edinburgh Medical College said that they would take her, provided she found some other women. So she put out an advertisement in the Scotsman. And, six other women came forward, six other Scottish women, one of whom was, as you say, Edith Peccei. And, they entered Edinburgh Medical College. Right from the beginning, they had a very tough time. And this sort of mirrors, subsequent events, because from the beginning, they were harassed, they were jeered at, they were abused by the male students, they had things thrown at them, they had messages left under their doors. And in fact, Edith Peccei, despite being very sort of self-deprecating, she ended up winning a medal for standing first in chemistry and physics. And when she won the medal, there was a huge outcry from the male students, and the medal was, taken away from her, and it was given to a male student, because, the male students were so furious, and they said it can't possibly be that a woman can be better than us. And this whole, incident played out years later, well, not that many years later, a few years later with, Hemabati Sen in India, who was a Bengali doctor, who also won a medal for standing first in class. And again, it was taken away from her and given to the men. And, so what happened with the Edinburgh Seven is that after, several of these incidents, after 3 years of study, the university decided to deny them their degrees. So they had spent 3 years studying for this medical degree, but the university said that they would not give them the degree because they believed that women should not be doctors. So, but Sophia Jex-Blake was not deterred. So she went away and thought about it, and she started the London School of Medicine along with two other women who are also mentioned. And this became, which was only intended for women. And this became a sort of, uh, really important medical college in across the world, because it trained not only British women, but also trained women from empire. And Rukmabai Raut, who was one of the women that I mentioned, eventually went there. So the Edinburgh Seven had this sort of lasting impact, on medicine. And eventually, of course, the Edinburgh Medical College let them in. And just the other day, I think in 2017, I think I mentioned, I forget dates, 2019, it finally gave these seven female students their degrees, these five women students their degrees. So it took them 150 years to get their medical degrees.
Long
So,
overdue.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Also, the Grant Medical College in Mumbai. It permitted women to study medicine by 1884, and there were 7 Indian women who enrolled into the college. Now, Grant Medical College and the museum share. The secretary of the Bhavdajilad of the museum, Dr. Bhavdajilad, after whom the museum is now named, he was one of the first graduates of the Grant Medical College. And not many people may know this, but he, in fact, was one of the earliest medical practitioners who sort of combined the traditional Indian medical systems along with Western medicine that he had studied here, and was credited with finding the early cure for leprosy. So the college also played an important part, as many of us now know, to give Waldemar Hafkin the playground sort of to develop the earliest vaccine against plague, which was so important for the entire country, the entire world, I would say. Now, there are a lot of visual prints that we have seen of the plague in Mumbai, which have been all over the internet, especially in the last 2 years, because of the similarities between both these epidemics in Mumbai. And what I noticed is a lot of women playing the role of nurses in these visual prints. When do you think the shift occurred, when women actually began performing surgeries or spearheading research? You do mention that Rukmabai Raut was given the Kaisar-e Hind, which was a very high honorary medal for her services during the plague.
Right. It's hard for me to pinpoint an exact time, but I think possibly Rukmabai Raut was possibly the earliest to actually be involved in research like this, which was not, before her, women were mostly confined to gynecological and, looking after childbirth. And I also think it depended on where they were living. Rukmabai Raut was, she was from Mumbai, and then of course she practiced in Surat and Rajkot. Whereas Hemavati Sen was in rural West Bengal, where women doctors were still not completely accepted, and of course she was less well educated than the others, and therefore she was confined to very small sort of kind of operations, and again mostly childbirth, gynecological, and not surgery. So but I think perhaps Rukmabai Raut did win a lot of respect, and the plague was rampant at that time, and she was able to get involved with it, and they did not have the luxury of, they needed all hands on deck. They did not have the luxury of looking to just men, or so I think it probably started with her. It's very hard to pinpoint exactly, but after that, if you look at the difference between the early lady doctors such as Anandi Bai, who didn't get to do much. Of course, she died very early, but the medicine that she practiced or that she learned. And then you see, Mary Poonen Lucas, who was in the 1920s and was able to kind of, really make a difference in terms of public health, vaccination, and, sort of bringing more modern medicine. There was a certain definite change By the 1920s, women were being involved in these public health decisions, especially, for instance, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, who managed to establish a cancer hospital, even though cancer at that time was considered an untreatable disease. The view was that if you get cancer, you're just better off dying rather than being treated. So by the 1920s, I think things slowly started changing. So,
Connecting back to my first question about these funds that were now being set up,
right.
the Lady Dufferin also set up a fund on the insistence and encouraged by Queen Victoria in 1855. And this enabled a lot of British women doctors to
Right.
come and practice in India. You have written extensively about how this practice also, while of course helping the movement to educate women and getting women
Yeah.
into the practice, also marginalized the same women who they were trying to get in. Can you elaborate upon that?
I mean, opinions on the Dufferin Fund are very mixed, and again, I mean, you say I've written extensively. Now, when I look back, I think I wish I had written more. The trick was to make this whole book readable and not too long and academic. But the Dufferin Fund, as you said, was basically set up by Lady Dufferin in order to bring medical care to India, and it started with very good intentions, and it also did a lot of good work. It set up many universities and colleges across India, but it also had its downsides, and one of the downsides that I mentioned, which Kadambini Ganguly encountered, who was the second woman, was that the Dufferin Fund really preferred European women, particularly British women or Anglo-Indian women to Indian doctors. Okay, it had a very sort of colonial sort of mindset in which it would send European doctors who didn't speak the language, were not aware of the culture, and would put them in charge of hospitals. And the Indian women who are being doctors, training to be doctors, and who had become doctors, they were sort of treated as sort of glorified hospital assistants, and they were paid much less. I mean, the difference was, I think, the Indians were paid about 50 rupees per month, and the Europeans were paid about 450 rupees per month, even though they had the same qualifications. Which is why the only letter that I could trace of Kadambini Ganguly was a very quiet woman, I think. And the only time I see her writing a letter was when she wrote saying that, Indian women doctors have just not been given the opportunity to excel. They're not given charge of a ward, even though we have the same qualifications. And eventually she went to the UK to study because she felt that her Indian degree wasn't sufficient. So that was one thing. The other thing is that the Dufferin Fund also, it believed in that whole zenana concept. They believed that Indian women would never step out of their zenanas. And while this was true to a certain extent, it was not true of every Indian women, because lower caste Indian women and working, women who had to work in the fields were leaving the house. They weren't staying at home. So there was, and they also believed that Indian women could not be trained to be doctors because, they were too shy and retiring, and they were in parda. And this was not the case, as we always see in Anandibai's case and Kadambini's case. There was also an Indian Renaissance which helped, Indian women, encourage Indian women to be doctors. And lastly, the Dufferin Fund was very evangelical in character, and in women, even women like, Sophia Jack's play criticized the Dufferin Fund and said that, if you choose somebody because they're a missionary first and a doctor second, you're going to have very poor quality doctors. And there was that evangelical tinge at the beginning where they tried to kind of civilize, the heathens in India by bringing religion to them. So these were the faults of the Dufferin Fund. And of course, it had many advantages as well. So, which I talk about. Yeah.
Um, One of the most interesting things, what I read while going through the stories of the 6 doctors you have selected, is the intersectionality that exists, of course, between the caste of these women and what they could achieve, and the nuances therein. There's also so many facets of feminism itself that one encounters while reading their stories, from how the liberal male reformers, say of the Arya Samaj or Brahmo Samaj, looked at women education, particularly education of women in medicine, to the almost skeptical while also appeasing sort of feminism of Anandibai Joshi, to a radical person like Hemabati Sen or Rukmabai Raut, who also
Yes,
divorces her husband and pursues what she wants to do with her life.
true.
Can you also discuss the sort of complex socio-cultural matrix these earliest women medical practitioners were going through to achieve their dreams?
So it's a complicated question, and I think the answer may take days in if I reply at length. But yes, there is every sort of feminism, if you want to call it that, reflected in this book. Every kind of feminism is reflected there. You have the traditional, more traditional sorts such as Anandi Bai, who also was not entirely traditional, and then you have sort of the radicals like Rukma Bai. They are all reflected in this book. So, I mean, coming to what you asked, see, Anandibai was a Brahmin woman, in that ways many privileged. But at the same time, she was not without her difficulties, because she was not allowed to cross the ocean, because once you cross the ocean, your caste would you would lose your caste. You would if you cross the ocean, that's what happens. For Brahmin people are not supposed to cross the ocean. So she actually had to stand up in front of the community and ask their permission to go abroad for studying without her husband. And Anandibai Joshi, I call the chapter on her the good wife. And, that's a nice sort of turn of phrase, but she wasn't always a good wife. In order to get the education, she conformed to, these traditional trappings. She wore traditional clothes. She never changed that. She refused to eat meat, even though she was advised to eat meat by the doctors in Philadelphia because it was so cold and there was no vegetarian food available. And she stayed married to her husband Gopal Rao, even though he was abusive, and she continued to kind of be a good Indian wife in that way. But behind all that, there was so much conflict. I mean, you can see in her letters that she kind of chafes against all these restrictions that Gopal Rao puts on her. He was an abusive husband. He used to beat her. And she says, you shouldn't have done that, and you shouldn't have done this. And she also chafes against many other things, the Orientalism that she encountered in America, where people put a lot of pressure on her to convert to Hinduism, to convert to Christianity. And she writes of her resentment at this, because at the time, in this whole sort of colonialist mindset, Americans believed that Hindu women could not achieve anything. You had to be Christian, you had to kind of be studying a Christian setup. So she was very resentful about all of that, and she fought back as much as she could against all of that. I still think that if Anandi Bai had lived longer, we would have seen more from her in terms of defying social cultural mores. But she had to walk a tightrope, because the only way she could get an education was, one, in order to follow the societal norms set in India for her, and also to follow the societal norms set in the US for her. So that was the only way, because she was the first. That was the only way she could get an education. Now, by the time we come to Rukmabai Raut, I mean, Rukmabai Raut just didn't care. She was a rule breaker. That's why I call her the rule breaker. She broke all the rules. She left she was in a child marriage, and, that she wanted to escape and get an education. She went to court to divorce her husband against his will. She stood up to, Hindu traditionalists and said that Hindu marriage is not a sacrament and that the woman can escape at any time. At the time, most people consider that Hindu marriage is for life. Once you get married, you are married for life. You can never escape. This is your life, and you have to do as your husband tells you. And Rukmabai was amazing in that she faced so much opposition from Bal Gangadhar Tilak, as I mentioned in the book, and other Hindu conservatives, who said very clearly that leaving your husband to get an education is unacceptable, and this is basically defying the entire Hindu way of life. So she was very brave, and she was a complete radical feminist. She never married. She eventually divorced her husband, went to the UK, studied, came back to Surat, where she practiced for 35 years alone. And she never married. So she was a completely radical feminist, and she broke all the rules and yet managed to lead a good life. And thanks in part to, support from many liberals and, the British press and all that as well, and mentors in terms of Edith Peachy. So you have all kinds of feminism. And then you have in the middle sort of Hemabati Sen, who again was a very interesting woman, a Bengali rural woman who, studied medicine on her own and, managed to kind of, who was a child widow and still managed to study medicine and practice for many years on her own. I'm not sure whether she would even have recognized the word feminism if it was presented to her. She was just doing what she wanted to do in order to feed her children and her family. So yeah.
Yes, feminism, what we understand today, is so different. And of course, these women were also working within the constraint as well as against the constraints of the society,
Yes.
yet also needed to be accepted by that very society in able to
Correct.
order, to
Correct. Like
practice.
all of them had, no matter where they came from, all of them had to work, some more than others. Rukmabai, of course, had caste because she was a lower caste woman. She had caste to fight against. And that, I think, is primarily why Tilak was so opposed to her, because, he thought that, his lower caste woman is basically turning Hinduism on its head. So Rukmabai had far more to deal with than most of them, but all of them had this sort of tightrope to walk. If they were confined too much to societal norms, then they would end up not doing anything. But if they conform too little to societal norms, then they would be outcasts. So there was a constant sort of tightrope, and I think that hasn't changed in India. Indian women still have to sort of be on that tightrope and keep everybody happy. So
There is also this fact that when many of them were denied opportunities, they just sort of created and pushed against the existing infrastructure to create those opportunities. What is commonly said that if somebody doesn't want to share the stage with you, you build your own stage. There were instances where women constantly wrote to the universities, and the universities had to sort of go above and beyond what they were normally expected to do by the rule book to create spaces where these women could come in and change things slowly, one by one. Of course, no change happens overnight. And also, there was so many more impact rather than just study medicine and practice medicine. That had a sort of domino effect in raising the age of consent, child marriage, getting universal franchise. I want you to talk a bit about all these sort of domino effects that came in.
yeah. You are absolutely right. They all built their own stages, just like, Sophia Jex-Blake, when she couldn't find a university that would take her, she set up her own university, the London School of Medicine. All these women, in various ways, made their own stage. It started with Anandibai, who stood up in front of the community and said, "I'm going overseas. I seek your permission. I will do as you say, but I'm going." And that allowed her to go overseas, which in those days was a huge, huge sort of endeavor, crossing the oceans unknown at the age of 18. So that happened with Anandi Bai. And then Kadambini Ganguly again was a very quiet woman, and we have very little information about her. But she was instrumental in getting medical colleges to accept women, because she got Calcutta Medical College to accept her when they would not accept women. And she managed to graduate. The second thing she did was to enter politics at a time when there were very few women in politics. And that sort of gave people the idea that women should be in all facets of public life. They have a say. They are 50% of the population. And from there it just went increased. Rukmabai Raut, of course, broke all the rules after her. And as you say, she was also, her case was also instrumental in raising the age of marriage. They raised the age for you know girls from, I think, up to, I've forgotten now. Is it up to 12? This is the problem when you write a book, you tend to forget it when the next day. So they raised the age of marriage raise the age of consent up to 12. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but earlier it was like there was no age of consent. 9-year-olds were getting married and, uh, forced to confirm and have, sexual relations with their husbands. So Rukmabai's plight sort of focused the, spotlight on so many unhappy women who were in child marriages and who could not escape. So Rukmabai also did a lot of fundraising for women students. And again, when she came back to India, she practiced on her own for 35 years. That in itself brought more women doctors into the spotlight and made them more acceptable. Then we go on to the three women mentioned in the second half of the book. Hemabati Sen, a Bengali woman doctor who was a child widow, married again. Her second husband was also a wastrel, so she had to feed her family. So she entered medical education, and she became a doctor in the rural areas of West Bengal and brought medicine to so many villages. Okay, which was very much needed because the better educated doctors would confine themselves to the big cities. So she and other what's called vernacular licentiate VLMS, they brought medicine into the many rural areas. Okay, sometimes it was not a very high quality of medicine, but nevertheless it was better than what was available, and it brought women doctors again in on the stage. People began to say, oh, you can have women doctors. Then they come to Muthulakshmi Reddy and Mary Poonen Locos, both of whom played a huge part in public policy. Muthulakshmi Reddy became more of a legislator than a doctor to the second part of her life. She was involved in public life. She was a Gandhian, and that brought all its advantages and disadvantages. But she was involved in the Devadasi bill, in passing the Devadasi abolition bill, in which they abolished the Devadasi custom. She was also involved in getting women the vote because she fought very hard for Indian women to get the vote. She was also involved in setting up the Adyar Cancer Hospital in Chennai, to treat people with cancer and to treat them for very little or for free. So she played a huge part in, policy, in public health, in, women being involved in politics. And then lastly, we have Mary Poonen Locos, who was basically the royal physician of the Travancore royal family in Travancore. And she was very instrumental in Kerala's, health program. She pushed for vaccination. She pushed for compulsory vaccination at a time when nobody was even in favor of any vaccination at all. She spoke out against, homeopathy and Ayurveda. She was very much in favor of modern medicine. She was very much in favor of public health, and she was part of the state legislature. She was the only woman there. She was actually the first woman legislator in India, if you count that, if you consider Travancore, um, a state on its own, which it was. So she kind of spoke up in the legislature for anything involving women and children. So as you say, these women didn't just confine themselves to medicine. They, made women in public life acceptable. So.
And it's quite incredible to think of Mary Lucas fighting for compulsory vaccination. I mean, this is something that's again it's a living history right now, where there is a huge pandemic that requires universal vaccination. And when you think about how much compulsory vaccination has sort of benefited India over the last few decades, be it fighting smallpox or polio. And
yes, absolutely. So if you don't mind, I'd kind of like to read what Mary said in the legislature, Travancore Legislative Assembly. There was a resolution in which, which the male legislators were trying to pass, and there was a smallpox epidemic at the time. That's the context, just like we have COVID now. And there were male legislators trying to argue that vaccination should not be compulsory and children should be admitted to schools without them. It should be made, voluntary. If you want to take it, take it. And they were actually male legislators saying that, vaccination is more dangerous than smallpox. Okay, this was the level of, education in 1925. And Mary Poonen Lucas says, she says, smallpox is a disease spread by air. In crowded cities, isolation of the patient is impossible. Vaccination is the only option. Petty inconveniences and even risks have to be encountered by individuals for the sake of the greater good of the community as a whole. And she went on to cite statistics showing that compulsory vaccination had reduced mortality rates in smallpox. And of course, we know now that she was right. Okay, and it's the same thing. I mean, this woman was doing it in 1920s, and we are still arguing about COVID vaccinations a century later. But she was so ahead of her time.
What was the one common thread you found in all the stories that you were going through and unearthing at this point while writing your book?
I think it's something that we discussed in the sense that the common thread is that all the women had to walk this kind of societal tightrope. They had to please society, but not please it too much, because otherwise if they listen to everything that society would say, they would just be confined to their homes. So they had to be brave, but not too much. Be pioneers, but not too much. And I mean, the example that I give, like for instance, for Mary Poonen Locus again, when she was praised on her 80th birthday, like I mentioned, all the praise was for her work as a wife and mother. She was a wonderful wife, she was a wonderful mother, etc., etc. And nobody even spoke about all her kind of vaccination programs and public health programs. So it leads me to conclude that you have to be a good wife and mother. Of course, Rukma Bai wasn't, and she just broke all the rules. But overall, the women had to conform to certain societal norms so that they could be allowed their freedom. The second thing that I do mention is that in most of the cases, the women were aided by men in the family, because unfortunately, times were such that without a man, either your father or your husband, in most cases, it was the father. Sometimes it was the husbands who pushed women into education and supported them. Without them, you could hardly do anything. You couldn't kind of enter any of these universities or go overseas to get an education. So in many cases, the women were supported by men. And then, of course, there were other men who opposed them at every turn. So there were different types of men, really. So,
And I think that's true of even today, contemporary society. In so many
yes,
homes, for so many women, either if the father is supportive or the husband has to be 100% supportive
correct.
if you intend to pursue a career and be very good at it. It's
Okay.
still the same case.
And I wanted to mention here, for instance, this support was very complicated and a double-edged sword for many. For instance, in Anandibai Joshi's case, her husband Gopal Rao Joshi was a postman, and he was very encouraging of her education to the point where he was obsessive about it and he was abusive about it. For instance, he used to beat her for cooking and not studying. Okay, he used to say, "Don't cook, study." And Gopal Rao Joshi is a very interesting character, because when Anandibai finally, went overseas and gained fame, I think Gopal Rao felt a little sort of, fed up, and he was a little resentful, because after that, he went to the US and he gave a lot of speeches criticizing women, in support of child marriage, and criticizing women who get an education and all that. So it was one thing. In theory, a lot of men were in favor of their wives getting education. In practice, when it actually happened, many grew resentful and started to criticize their wives, and in some cases were abusive, and so on and so forth. And I think that plays out even today. So it is a very difficult thing to have your wife be more famous and more educated than you. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Uh, there was so many, I'm sure, research papers, books, archives that you had to go through to write this book. And if I'm not wrong, you began writing before the pandemic. Then the pandemic struck, and now it's out. And I remember there was a tweet you put out, I think a month or so back, talking about how hard it was to write about this when there is no access to archives, when there is
Yes.
no access to information. And of course, because these women were not necessarily, their histories are not known. We barely know anything about any women leaders from that period. How did you manage to sort of face these challenges and tease out that information?
So I can talk on this for hours, really, because it's a subject very close to my heart. One of the reasons, a lot of readers say, why don't we have nonfiction in India like we have in the West, fantastically researched and, with all this kind of, so many anecdotes, this, that. The main reason is that we don't have the libraries or the archives in India. India is not an archival culture. And if you go to any of these libraries, the effort you have to put in to just get like one document out of them, one letter out of them. It'll all be buried away somewhere, and they will hardly ever bring it out unless you go back and forth several times. All this tends to be very expensive because the information is scattered across India in various libraries. So it is very difficult. And a lot of this information, for instance, uh, you know, um Rukmabai Raut, there was a book about her. I could not find it in the whole of India, and I finally managed to get it from the University of British Columbia through a Canadian friend. So that's a lot of privilege talking. I have friends in other countries who managed to send me a lot of material. Again, same thing happened with one of Muthulakshmi Reddy's biographies. I could not find it in Chennai. I could not find it anywhere. Okay, so I had to get it from overseas, from an overseas library. And this is, most Indians can't do this. They don't have the network, or they can't afford it, or whatever. And uh, also, halfway through this entire process, I was lucky enough that I moved to the UK and I had access to the British Library. Without that, they'd have been a much thinner book, again, not accessible to most Indians. So, when people say that Indian nonfiction is not up there, cannot compete with Western fiction, that's because everything is so accessible to Western writers. So coming to how I solved this, I mean, I did the best I could. I think one area in which the book is very thin is that I was not able to trace many of the descendants of these doctors. They were just untraceable. And again, this is another thing which is very difficult in India. In the US, you have, social security numbers. You can trace anybody because everybody is documented. We don't have that in India. So it's very difficult to trace descendants. So I did the best with whatever descendants I could find. So in a way, it's a very archival book because I couldn't trace descendants. And those whom I did trace, they didn't have any memories of, a woman who died in the 1880s. They only had, memories of the current times. And in fact, they were able to tell me less than I could find out from the letters. So it's a very archival book. It's made up mostly of letters and memoirs and letters about them. And in some cases, most cases, the women didn't write memoirs. For instance, Mary Poonen Loco stopped writing a memoir when she got married. And I think this is common to many Indian women. Once you get married, it's all about the kids and the marriage, and there's no time to write memoirs. So I had to fill in bits of her life by looking at the memoir of another doctor, that too a British doctor who practiced in Travancore at the time, because there was literally no other way. I mean, I couldn't find anything about what Mary was doing. So I had to go to what the British doctor was doing. There was just no other way in order to fill in the gaps. So that was that. So I did visit a couple of libraries. I did, the Calcutta Library, but then the pandemic came, and that really affected everything because every library was closed. Like all the archives in Delhi were closed. Luckily, I was able to kind of, fill in the gaps by doing some research in the British Library. But it's a very difficult process. Again, if you look at the chapter on Kadambini, I was able to trace only one letter of hers. Everything else, all the other letters were written by her husband. The men wrote all the letters and the women sort of looked after the children at home. So, a history of Indian women is always going to have many gaps in it, I think. But I did, think that, the chapter on Hemabati Sen, she wrote a memoir which survived and was translated from Bangla. So that, I think that chapter is actually my favorite because we have so much written in her own words. So we know what she thought about it. So like this, if you do some digging, you can find something, but it's a difficult process. It's a very difficult process. So
Hope these kind of books, the more they come out, it also inspires people, or especially younger generations, which are now so adept at documenting every moment, digitally or on social media. I hope it inspires them to look at their own family history, which is what it inspired me to do. In fact, I remember when I was about 16, an uncle of mine, who is also a doctor, mentioning I had just enrolled for my BA in Wilson College in Mumbai. And I remember him mentioning taking out an old black and white photo of a class photograph outside the Wilson College of about 15 people, two of whom were women. And he points to one and he says, that's my mother in a Nawari sari. And she was one of the first women graduates in science from Wilson College. And I had no clue about this. till
Right.
that point. And I just visited him and told him I'm going to start studying at Wilson. And when I read this book, and this has gone away from my memory as well, but when I read your book, I remembered that, and I have actually messaged him like, please scan that photograph wherever it is, please. So these kind of stories need to come out, I think, from within families as
I
well.
totally agree. And the thing is that until recently, nobody considered that women had anything, of importance to say. Because Hemabati Sen's memoir, which she wrote it in Bangla, it remained at the bottom of a trunk for over 100 years before it was finally retrieved. It was in a notebook and then translated into English. That's another thing that I forgot to mention. So many of the accounts by women are in obviously in Marathi, Bangla, and other languages which I do not read. And it is very difficult in India to find translators. I remember one of the Marathi memoirs, I hired a translator to translate. And after a while, she said, I can't do it because it's just too technical. It's a very old Marathi, form of Marathi. I can't translate it. And she was, a very good translator. So it's quite difficult, because you have so much material in languages that not all of us read, and it is difficult to get them translated. Whereas, in the West, you may just have one language, English or Spanish or French or whatever. You won't have 16 different languages in order to translate from. But I totally agree with you that we need to kind of, keep these stories of women and dig out stories of women and, kind of try to sort of archive them better.
Yes. And was this kind of material that was available to you dictate how much of information you wanted to share or not? How did you shape the narrative of the book?
So I was very, very clear that the book has to be a general interest book, which anyone can read. And I still get people telling me, oh, you have written a book, but I'm not a doctor, so I don't think I can understand it. This is not a medical book. It's not a technical book. It's a very simple, I hope, easy to read book. I was very clear that I wanted the book to be, because there are innumerable books. I mean, just on Anandi by Joshi, we have so much material, but it's all written in a very academic style, and that's fine. That suits a certain audience, but I wanted to write for a more general audience. So I have tried to keep it very simple. And again, I wanted to keep it could have been a lot longer. I wanted to keep it short, within 70 to 80,000 words, and be accessible to everybody. So, my main thing, in the book, you notice that each person is described as with a certain sort of, has a chapter. And, Andibai is the good wife, Rukmabai is a rule breaker, Kadambini is the working mom, Hemabati is the fighter, and, Mutulakshmi is the lawmaker, and the last one is Mary Poonan Lukos is the is the Surgeon General, because she was the first Surgeon General of India, which again I forgot to mention in this conversation. But yeah, so I wanted the personalities to come out rather than a long string of dates, because history with dates is very dull history. I didn't want a long string of dates. In 1885 they did this, in 1886 they opened this college, but I wanted their personalities to come out. And of course that was difficult, because again, material was thin. And I hope that I tried my best with all borrowing materials from everywhere, like I said, for instance, where I could not find what somebody thought about it, I looked into what other women at the time were doing, or what they thought about it. So just to get an idea on the times rather than say the person, because you can't always figure out what they think about it. For instance, again, in Kadambini's case, there's just so little material. Maybe somebody will read this book and say, oh, I have this story about her, but it's hard to find it in a country of 1 billion. So my aim was to make their personalities shine. And a lot of people have told me, but you missed out X doctor and you missed out Y doctor. And it's true, this is not a comprehensive book. But the thing is that many of those doctors, for instance, like you mentioned, Motibai Kapadia, I couldn't find any information on her. And maybe there will be subsequent books about these women, So I couldn't include everybody. And there are so many, there's Jerusha Girard from Grant Medical College, there's Motibai Kapadia, there's, Anne Jagannathan, there are so many other women, but there's very little material on all of them. So
there is an encyclopedia, it's in Marathi, on the women doctors sorry, not the women doctors, the women artists of the
Uh-huh.
JJ School of Art during the
Right.
early modern. And I hope your book inspires somebody, and all the research that other academics have done on
Yes.
doctors and women medical practitioners in India
Right.
or South
Absolutely. Yeah. I
India.
mean, there could be another whole book written on women lawyers, after Cornelius Sorabji and others. So, yeah.
I think there is a need for these encyclopedic works to show and educate, of course, a present generation of women of what has come before them.
Can I just interrupt? And one point that I wanted to make, you asked me why I wrote this book. Another reason is because I see so many young men these days, men in general and young men in particular, saying things, on social media like, actually, men have made all the scientific advancements in this world. Other than Marie Curie, what have women done? It's the fact that we should all thank men making the scientific advancements. And this is not true. The fact is that women have made many scientific advancements and they have sort of been erased from history, okay, because the men felt threatened. And also women have been barred from getting education because again men felt threatened. So it's a bit sort of disingenuous to say that, oh, men have made all the advancements in history, because it's a fact. If you look up science, I mean, even Darwin, for instance, women believed that women's brains are inferior and that they should not become scientists. This was a sort of mindset. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to, I hope that men will read it as well, and it's not just for women, and realize that there were women working in vaccination, there were women working in public health, there were women setting up hospitals, there were women doing all these fantastic things. It's just that they are not in our textbooks or in our, written material or in our books anywhere. So,
Absolutely. On that note, we will go to questions.
okay, sure.
The first question we have received is, what was the response of Indian male leaders towards women doctors, and were there any Indian evangelists who supported this cause?
uh, Indian leaders, you mean like, for instance, Gandhi and Muthulakshmi Reddy had a very close bond. Okay. And in fact, it was thanks to Gandhi that Muthulakshmi Reddy entered public life at all. She wasn't certain. She was happy to be a doctor at that point. But he kind of, encouraged her to kind of enter public life because he felt that more women should be in the movement. Of course, Gandhi also has had many faults, but there's not enough time to go into many of his thoughts on many things. But he did believe that there should be more women in public life. So Gandhi was very encouraging, but that was towards the later half of women doctors. The early women doctors, yes, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and his Kesri paper were very encouraging of Anandibai Joshi. She was praised by the Kesri paper as doing the being a very good example to other women. But the reason why she was praised so much was because she followed all the rules, she stayed married, she clung on to her, she was very vocal about clinging on to her her customs, her Hindu customs, and resisting the pressure to be to convert to Christianity. So Kesri said about Anandibai, and at the time Bal Gangadhar Tilak was head of Kesri, it is indeed wonderful that a Brahmin lady has proved to the world that the great qualities, perseverance, unselfishness, undaunted courage, and an eager desire to serve one's country do exist in the so-called weaker sex. So Kesri was quite a conservative paper, but they were very sort of supportive of Anandibai because she followed all the rules, and also I think partly because she was a Brahmin. When Rukmabai came along, Kesri was not happy. Okay. And Kesri criticized, both the Kesri and the Maratha criticized Rukmabai uh, so much. And in fact, here is what Kesri said about Rukmabai: it is a great sin to equate a dissolute woman with one whose renowned epic would inspire Hindus. So they are comparing Rukmabai to Anandibai Joshi. Anandibai did not give up even in the minutest bit. They use that word minutest. It's not a word, but they use it. Her own religion, proper conduct as a woman, or our own customs and conventions. Okay. So as long as you maintain this proper conduct as a woman, then you had national leaders on your side. Having said that, there were a number of reformers who the Phule's, Jyotibai Phule and Savitribai Phule, who supported women's education, also Gokhale, Ranade, they all supported women's education even in science. They believed that women should be educated even in science. So there were people who supported them at that time. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
We are going to go to the third question that has just come in, because it takes off from what you just said. Uh, the question is from Vidula Kamat Patel. Would these lady doctors have succeeded getting a medical education without support of male relatives or peers? And I think we covered that earlier as well. It would have been very difficult, I think.
I think some of them would have succeeded. For instance, Rukmabai got support initially from her stepfather, Dr. Sakharam Arjun, but then he passed away. While she was in the middle of fighting her case, he passed away and she had no male figure in her life. She continued to fight the case. She went overseas. She studied there, which could not have been easy in the UK. And then she returned to Surat and practiced there for 35 years on her own. So while there have been men in their lives maybe gave them the impetus, they went on to do better things. For instance, Mary Poonan Lukos, she was encouraged by her father. He sent her overseas to study. But again, he died in the middle of her medical study. She still had to continue. She did not drop out. She came back and then she set up practice on her own, and she became the physician for the royal Travancore royal family. Again, that was accomplished entirely on her own. So I think several of them might have done it, even without the men in their lives. Muthulakshmi Reddy, in fact, she says very clearly that she does not believe that marriage is a good idea for medical women. She thinks that, it just gets in the way. So I don't think perhaps she found, balancing marriage and, her endeavors in public life very easy. So it really depends. And Hemabati Sen, for instance, Hemabati Sen was married at age 9 to a 45-year-old man, and who died very soon after, leaving her widowed with absolutely no money. She married again to another man who was a wastrel and could not support the family. So in a way, she didn't get much support at all. She had to do it entirely on her own without any kind of support. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. There was some initial support and then later they made their own way. So
there is one question by Vrunda Fadke. Did these lady doctors get any support from the establishments now that they were part of? Did they face any difficulties from the establishments themselves?
yes, they did. As we talk about in the book, Kadambini was not allowed to enter the Calcutta Medical College. They denied her entry. And it was only after a lot of pressure from the Brahmo community that, they finally allowed her to enter. Then she was not given, she was treated as an inferior to the Europeans, by the Dufferin Fund. So that was another thing. Then in Hemabati Sen, I think in her case, the lack of support from the establishment is more clear, because she entered the Campbell Medical College to study as a doctor. She won a medal. The medal was actually taken away from her and given to the men. And there was a huge riot in which her life was threatened. There were male students, going on strike and throwing stones and threatening to kill her. So eventually she was forced to give up the medal and she accepted a cash prize instead. Then Hemabati Sen went on to work in West Bengal for many years, and she continued to have so many problems from the establishment. She would be threatened by the other male doctors. The establishment would not back her because she's a woman, and God knows she has strange men, people coming to her house at times of day, and etc., etc. So many of them again did not receive. Again, Muthulakshmi Reddy, uh, she was she was not allowed to enter the Madras Medical College until a lot of pressure was applied. Okay, a lot of pressure was applied. Then secondly, when she had to set up the Adyar Cancer Hospital, people were like, why do you need to set up a cancer hospital? There is absolutely no need. It's just a disease that everybody dies of, and with great difficulty, she set it up with, to get the funding and everything else. Again, she faced a lot of difficulty in her public life as a woman legislator, because they were constantly, male legislators telling her things like, for instance, when she was trying to work for the vote for women and trying to raise the age of marriage, there were constantly traditional male legislators who were telling her, you cannot disturb the Hindu way of life. I mean, religion was always used as this sort of weapon to kind of, say that, no, this is the way of Hindu way of life. We marry our women off early. We do not believe in giving them education, the vote, or anything else. Again, Mary Poonen Lucas had the same kind of problems. When she entered the Travancore legislature, a lot of the male legislators said, oh, you have a foreign education. You can't be coming back and telling us how we do things in Kerala. And she had to stand up for herself. And she said very clearly that, again, Mary Poonen Lucas was not allowed to study science, because in Travancore in those days, girls were not allowed to study science. And this was the case in most of India. So these women would try to become doctors with having just this rudimentary knowledge of, English, a little bit of maths, and, mostly kind of, languages or needlework or something like that, which was of no help at all. So because of that, I think their feat is all the more amazing and impressive.
That's true. Thank you so much, Kavita, for being with us and engaging with us and discussing your very important book. And I do hope that you'll be back at the museum physically, or we can also do another online event with you in the future. To all our audiences who have joined us online, thank you once more. And please be in touch with the museum, become a friend of the museum. There is a lot on offer for very diverse range of ages, as well as we do programs not just in English, but also in Hindi and Marathi. So there is something for everybody. If you want to get subscribed to our mailing list, please write to us at education@bdlmuseum.org or DM us on social media, and we'll put you on the list. Again, thank you, Kavita. And
thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here.